This year, 2020, marks the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. The amendment that stated that the right to vote cannot be denied or abridged on the basis of sex. While that amendment was passed in 1920, it was the culmination of more than a century's worth of work for the right for women's suffrage. Many organizations and individuals fought for that right throughout the 1800s because as of 1807, all states had denied women the right to vote. In the early to mid 1800s, women's suffrage and the abolition movement become linked, especially so in 1848 at the Seneca Falls Convention, often regarded as the first convention for women's rights in the United States. Spearheaded by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, that convention would host a numerous amount of famous orators, such as Frederick Douglass. But there's a notable group of people that were missing from that convention, because there was not a single black woman present. And that's not because they weren't involved in the movement. Instead, they were denied access by the white women that ran that organization and started that convention. But women, specifically black women, were involved in that movement. They were leaders of that movement, such as Sojourner Truth, who throughout the 1800s would give numerous speeches on both abolition of slavery and women's rights. Even after the passing of the 15th Amendment, which gave black men the right to vote in the United States, she would continue giving speeches, pressing for women's suffrage to be extended to them. Many of the organizations that were fighting for women's suffrage throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s would still exclude black women from their ranks, such as the National American Women's Suffrage Association, often seen as the largest suffrage association in the United States, and here in Virginia, the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia, which was the largest organization here in this state. Both of them would continue to deny black women the right to join them. Another black woman who would be a leader in the suffrage movement and who would use her voice in favor of voting rights for women would be none other than Maggie Walker herself. The earliest speech that we have, where she talks about voter rights and the importance of voting, would come in 1903. When she would urge black women to make sure that their husbands and the other men in their lives are exercising their right to vote. Because just 1 year earlier, the state of Virginia altered its constitution to input literacy tests and poll taxes in order to limit the black vote as much as possible. And Mrs. Walker knew that it would take the effort of both black men and black women to now exercise the right to vote in this state. But 9 years later, in 1912, in a speech that she would give about the economic opportunities of black women, she would say something very different. In a section talking about equal pay for women, Maggie Walker would say, quote, "Of course the women rebel and are rebelling and rebellious even at this present moment. Yet capital is deaf and will never hear their cries until the women force capital to hear them at the ballot box and to do just and honest by them as to the men." And there she's calling for women to have the right to vote, to increase their economic opportunities. Mrs. Walker would work with organizations in favor of suffrage, such as the National Association of Colored Women. And eventually, in 1920, that fight would pay off. Because the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate would both pass the amendment. And finally, on August 18th, Tennessee would be the 36th state to pass the amendment. And then on August 26th, 1920, the right for women to vote in this country became law.
On August 26th of 1920, Maggie L. Walker was not in Virginia. She was about halfway through a nearly 1 month-long vacation that had become customary for her to take following the conclusion of her fraternal order's annual conventions. But thanks to her 1920 diary, we know that Maggie L. Walker will return to Richmond in early to mid-September and then register herself to vote very soon after that. Her diary also reveals to us that in the week after Walker registered herself to vote, there will be 3 meetings in which black leaders in Richmond get together to discuss what the voting registration process for black women was going to look like. In fact, Maggie Walker herself hosts one of those meetings at her office building, the St. Luke Hall. We don't know all of what was discussed and concluded at those meetings, but what's clear is that Walker emerges from them a leader in this new effort. Because on September 20th of 1920, when women were invited to Richmond City Hall, the image that you see here to my left, when women were invited there to register to vote in large numbers for the first time, Walker wasn't there just that day. She comes again the next day and again 2 days after that. And it wasn't just to register herself to vote. Remember, she's taken care of that already. Instead, she was there to help prepare the black women who showed up for the registration process and also to keep an eye on the registrars themselves. And the reason she needed to do that is because for the last 18 years, the state of Virginia had made it nearly impossible for African Americans to vote, thanks to all of those restrictions placed on the voting registration process from the state's 1902 convention. So if you're Maggie L. Walker at this moment in 1920, you may be saying to yourself, the 19th Amendment is a victory for women in general. It's a victory for the country as well. But for black women, this victory was incomplete because the 19th Amendment wasn't doing anything to get rid of these restrictions on voting to make it as fair and equal as it needed to be. So when Walker shows up to City Hall for those 3 days in 1920 in September, she's skeptical about how fairly this process is going to play out for the black women involved. We know, thanks to newspaper reporting, that throughout the day on September 20th, Walker spends most of it with the black women, preparing them to register, but also keeps an eye on the white women who showed up as well. And when she noticed that white women were registering at a much faster rate than black women, Walker began to ask questions about why that was, only to be told the problem wasn't with the process itself, but with the lack of registrars. At which point Walker herself offered to become a registrar to speed things up, only to be told that it couldn't be done. At the end of the day, when the registrars were closing their windows, Walker again protested, noting that over 100 black women were still waiting in line to register to vote, only to be told once again that nothing could be done. At that moment, Walker turns to the black women at City Hall and tells them, "We'll come back tomorrow," a promise that both parties will keep. But by the time we get to the presidential election in November of 1920, despite the best efforts of Walker and other leaders in Richmond, white women in Richmond had registered to vote at a ratio of more than 4 to 1 over black women. So the fight to give women the right to vote may have been over, but the fight to provide equal access to the vote would continue on.
The story of black women, the 19th Amendment, and the ongoing fight for women's suffrage does not end in 1920. Ratification was indeed a great victory, but an incomplete one. Far too many exclusionary laws and segregationist policies proved to be obstacles for women to fully exercise their right to vote. Someone who is of a less persistent personality than Maggie Walker would certainly be discouraged. But Mrs. Walker was not. Not only did she register herself to vote, not only did she help organize groups to register black women to vote, She ran for public office. You see, in 1921, the state Republican Party of Virginia decided that it wanted to shed its image as the party of the Negro. They excluded blacks from the state nominating conventions, and they ran a lily white ticket. The black Republican political leaders decided to run an all black ticket, which included John Mitchell, the fighting editor of the Richmond Planet, running for governor, and Maggie Walker as superintendent of public instruction. So you see, Mrs. Walker ascribed to a philosophy that the greatest power on earth for the righting of wrongs is the power of agitation. She would take decisive action to stand up and fight for rights that were being denied, so that all could eventually exercise their full rights of citizenship. She was of the philosophy that there is no reason for anyone to stand by idly waiting with folded arms saying there is nothing I can do, but to get up and actually do something, even if it meant, as it did for her, that they may not reap the benefits of those actions within their own lifetime. Maggie Walker's good friend and contemporary, Mary McLeod Bethune, is quoted as saying this: "If we had the tenacity of our forebears, who stood like a rock against the lash, we ourselves will find a way in our day as they did in theirs." Little did they know that it would take decades for those obstacles, those poll taxes, the literacy tests, the grandfather clauses, to be struck down by later laws in the 1960s, such as the Voting Rights Act of 1965, to finally break down more of those barriers that were excluding women like Maggie Walker and other groups from fully exercising their rights as citizens. It took them to see and fight and lay that foundation so that in the future we would be able to defend rights as needed. So we at Maggie L. Walker National Historic Site ask you to ask yourself, which rights do you see need to be defended? Which injustices do you see need to be called out? What causes would cause you to unfold your arms and actually do something?